behind the golden gates of Aldoria Palace, where tradition runs deeper than ancient bloodlines and secrets are currency more valuable than crown jewels, a storm has been brewing for 20 years. What appeared to be a fairy tale marriage between Crown Prince Alexander and his beloved Princess Isabella has been nothing more than an elaborate performance, hiding a web of deception so intricate that when it finally unravels, it will threaten to bring down the entire monarchy. The woman the kingdom adores as their future queen consort has been living a lie so monumental that its revelation will send shockwaves through not just the royal family, but the entire nation. For 2 decades, she has fooled everyone: the king, the queen, the press, and millions of devoted subjects who see her as the perfect royal bride. But Prince Alexander has discovered something that changes everything, a secret so devastating that it forces him to make an impossible choice: protect the crown he was born to wear, or expose the truth that will destroy everything his family has built. What happens when the most beloved member of the royal family is revealed to be the greatest threat they've ever faced? When love turns to betrayal, and trust becomes a weapon of destruction. When a prince must choose between his heart and his kingdom. This is the story of how one woman's deception nearly toppled a 1,000-year-old dynasty, and how a future king's quest for truth led to the most shocking royal banishment in modern history. The truth behind Princess Isabella's new sanctuary home isn't what the public believes. It's a prison built from lies, and the key to her freedom lies buried in a secret that could either save the kingdom or destroy it forever. Prepare yourself for a tale of love, betrayal, power, and at the price of truth in a world where image is everything and reality is whatever the crown declares it to be. The morning mist hung over Aldoria Palace like a shroud, and Prince Alexander Mordaunt stood at his office window watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens below. At 38, he possessed the kind of aristocratic bearing that made photographers weep with joy and political advisors sleep soundly at night. His dark hair was beginning to show distinguished threads of silver at the temples, and his blue eyes held the weight of a man who had never known a day without the burden of expectation pressing down upon his shoulders. But today, those same eyes burned with something far more dangerous than royal duty. Today, they blazed with the fire of a man who had finally seen behind the carefully constructed facade of his own life. The manila envelope on his mahogany desk seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its innocent appearance belying the nuclear bomb of information it contained. 24 hours ago, Alexander had been preparing for another routine state dinner, worried about nothing more pressing than trade negotiations with neighboring kingdoms and the eternal question of whether his wife Isabella would choose the emerald tiara or the diamond one. 24 hours ago, he had been a prince living in blissful ignorance of the greatest deception ever perpetrated against the Aldorian crown. Now, everything had changed. The door to his private study opened without ceremony, and Princess Isabella glided in with the fluid grace that had made her a darling of the international press. At 35, she remained breathtakingly beautiful, her auburn hair catching the morning light like spun copper, her green eyes sparkling with the warmth that had charmed world leaders and common citizens alike. She wore a cream-colored silk blouse and navy skirt that somehow managed to look both professional and effortlessly elegant, a skill she had mastered during her years as the kingdom's most beloved royal. "Darling, you missed breakfast again," she said, her voice carrying that musical quality that had first captivated him during a charity gala 20 years ago. "Cook is beside herself. She made your favorite blueberry scones, and when I left the dining room, she was muttering about ungrateful princes and considering early retirement." Alexander didn't turn from the window. In the reflection of the glass, he watched his wife move toward his desk with the confident stride of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. The irony was so bitter it made his chest ache. "I had some reading to catch up on," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions raging inside him. "Rather illuminating material, actually." Isabella laughed, the sound like silver bells in the morning air. "Please tell me it's not another one of Father Edmund's theological treatises. I swear that man could make the second coming sound tedious." She was behind him now, close enough that he could smell her signature perfume, a custom blend of jasmine and sandalwood that the palace's perfumer had created exclusively for her. It was a scent that had comforted him through sleepless nights of grief when his mother died, that had filled their bedroom during quiet Sunday mornings when the weight of the crown felt bearable, that had surrounded him during state functions when her presence beside him made the endless parade of diplomatic smiles feel authentic. Now it made his stomach turn. Actually, Alexander said, finally, turning to face her, it was a dossier from the Royal Intelligence Service. Quite a page-turner, really. Full of fascinating biographical information about someone very close to me. Something flickered across Isabella's face, so quickly that someone who hadn't spent 2 decades studying every micro-expression might have missed it. But Alexander caught it, that momentary tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in her posture. It lasted perhaps 1/10 of a second before her practiced smile returned, but it was enough. "How mysterious," she said, moving to perch on the arm of his leather reading chair with characteristic elegance. "Anyone I know?" Alexander picked up the manila envelope and extracted a single photograph, black and white and slightly grainy with age. It showed a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, with dark hair and eyes that held a hardness that seemed incongruous with her youthful face. She was standing beside a man in military fatigues outside what appeared to be a refugee camp, both of them looking directly into the camera with expressions that suggested they were very comfortable with violence. "Do you recognize her?" Alexander asked, extending the photograph toward his wife. Isabella took it with steady hands, her face a mask of polite curiosity as she studied the image. When she looked up, her expression was one of mild confusion tinged with concern. "I'm afraid not," she said gently. "Should I?" "Alexander, darling, you're beginning to worry me. You've been strange for days now, ever since that meeting with Director Hawthorne from Intelligence. What's all this about?" The performance was flawless. If Alexander hadn't already read the full dossier, if he didn't know exactly who was staring back at him from that 20-year-old photograph, he would have believed her completely. Isabella had always been an exceptional actress, but he had assumed it was merely one of the useful skills that royalty developed to navigate the endless theater of public life. He had never imagined that their entire marriage was just her most ambitious role. "Her name was Sophia Reeves," Alexander said carefully, watching every flicker of expression across his wife's face. "Born in Cardiff to a factory worker and a seamstress. Dropped out of school at 16 and fell in with a rather unsavory crowd of political radicals. By 18, she had been arrested 3 times for violent protest activities. By 20, she had disappeared entirely from British soil after being implicated in a bombing that killed 4 people in Manchester." Isabella handed the photograph back to him, her movements controlled and graceful. "How terrible," she said softly. "But I still don't understand why you're showing me this, or what it has to do with us." Alexander set the photograph aside and extracted another document from the envelope, this one a birth certificate bearing official seals and stamps. Sophia Reeves was declared dead in a car accident in Romania in 2004. He continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "Tragic, really. Apparently, the vehicle went off a mountain road during a blizzard. The body was burned beyond recognition, identified only through dental records that were later discovered to have been falsified." "Alexander, please." Isabella's voice carried a note of genuine distress now, though whether it was concern for his apparent obsession or fear of where this conversation was leading, he couldn't tell. "I don't understand why you're telling me about this woman. What does any of this have to do with our family?" Alexander met her eyes directly for the first time since she had entered the room. "Because 6 months after Sophia Reeves died, a young woman named Isabella Hartwell appeared in London society. Beautiful, charming, perfectly educated, with just enough of a tragic backstory to be interesting without being too specific to verify. An orphaned daughter of diplomats, raised by elderly relatives who conveniently died just before she burst onto the scene. No close friends from childhood, no schoolmates who remembered her, no paper trail extending back more than a few years." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. Isabella sat perfectly still on the arm of the chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face a serene mask that revealed nothing. But Alexander could see the rapid pulse at the base of her throat, could sense the coiled tension in her body like a spring wound too tightly. "That's quite an imagination you've developed," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm Alexander could sense brewing beneath her calm exterior. "But I'm afraid I don't appreciate the implication." Alexander extracted the final document from the envelope, a DNA analysis report bearing the official seal of 3 independent laboratories. "The coffee cup you used yesterday morning," he explained conversationally. "Director Hawthorne had it tested against samples obtained from Sophia Reeves' former residence. The genetic markers are a perfect match." Isabella looked down at the report for a long moment, her face unreadable. When she raised her eyes again, something had fundamentally changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something sharp and calculating that Alexander had never seen before. It was like watching a beloved family pet suddenly reveal itself to be a predator. "Well," she said quietly, rising from the chair with fluid grace. "I suppose congratulations are in order. Your intelligence service is more competent than I gave them credit for." The casual admission hit Alexander like a physical blow. Some part of him had still been hoping, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, that there would be an explanation, that the woman he had loved for 20 years would somehow still be the person he thought she was. 20 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 20 years of marriage, of sharing my bed, of planning our future together. 20 years of you sitting beside me at state functions, advising me on matters of national importance, being trusted with state secrets. Who are you really working for? Isabella moved to the window where he had been standing, looking out at the gardens with an expression he couldn't read. "Does it matter now?" she asked. "You've already made up your mind about what happens next." "I want to understand," Alexander said, and was surprised to discover that despite everything, it was true. "I need to know why. Was any of it real? Did you ever feel anything genuine for me? Or was it all just an assignment?" She was quiet for so long that Alexander began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weariness that seemed to age her years in moments. "Do you really want the truth, Alexander? Or do you want some comforting lie that will let you sleep at night?" "I want the truth." Isabella turned to face him, and, for the first time since he had known her, her mask slipped completely. What he saw underneath was not the monster he had been preparing himself to confront, but something infinitely more complex and heartbreaking. "I was 22 when they recruited me," she said quietly. "Not some shadowy government agency or terrorist organization, despite what your intelligence files probably suggest. I was recruited by people who believed that the monarchies of Europe had become too powerful, too insular, too dangerous to the future of democracy. People who thought that change could only come from within." "You're talking about revolutionaries." "I'm talking about idealists," Isabella corrected. "People who believed that someone with access to the highest levels of government could gather information that would help prevent wars, expose corruption, protect innocent people from the machinations of the powerful." Alexander felt a bitter laugh escape his throat. "And you volunteered to seduce a prince for the cause." "I volunteered to infiltrate high society," Isabella said sharply. "You weren't even supposed to be the target. The plan was to work my way into the circles around Parliament, to gather intelligence on defense contracts and trade negotiations. Meeting you at that charity gala was an accident, but you adapted quickly enough." Isabella's face softened slightly, and, for a moment, Alexander caught a glimpse of the woman he had fallen in love with. "Yes," she admitted. "I adapted, because you were different from what I had been taught to expect. You were kind and thoughtful, and you actually seemed to care about using your position to help people rather than just to accumulate power. And because—" She trailed off, looking away from him again. "Because what?" "Because I fell in love with you, you impossible man." The words came out sharp and pained, as if they had been torn from her against her will. "Which was absolutely the worst thing that could have happened for someone in my position." Alexander stared at her, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet once again. "You're saying you actually loved me?" "I'm saying that somewhere between our third date and our engagement, Sophia Reeves stopped existing and Isabella Hartwell became real." She met his eyes with something that looked like desperation. "I tried to pull back, tried to distance myself from the mission, but my handlers wouldn't let me. They said I was in too deep, that I was too valuable to extract. And, by then, I didn't want to leave anyway. So you stayed, and you spied on me for 20 years. I stayed, and I protected you for 20 years, Isabella said fiercely. Do you have any idea how many assassination attempts I've helped prevent? How many plots against the royal family I've uncovered and quietly dismantled? Yes, I passed along information about trade negotiations and diplomatic strategies, but I also made sure that the people who wanted to hurt you never got close enough to try." Alexander felt his world tilt again, the clear lines of betrayal blurring into something more complicated and painful. "You're saying you were protecting me from your own people." "I was protecting you from everyone," Isabella said quietly. "Because somewhere along the way, protecting you became more important than any mission or ideology or promise I had made to people I barely remembered. Because you became my family, and I would have burned the world down before I let anyone hurt you." The raw honesty in her voice cut through Alexander like a blade. 20 years of marriage had taught him to read her moods and tells, and every instinct told him that she was telling the truth, which somehow made everything worse. "But you never told me," he said. 20 years, and you never trusted me enough to tell me who you really were. How could I?" Isabella's composure finally cracked, and tears began to track down her cheeks. "How could I tell the man I loved that everything he knew about me was a lie? How could I explain that I had deceived him so completely that even I didn't know where Sophia ended and Isabella began? How could I risk losing the only real thing I had ever had in my life?" Alexander wanted to comfort her, wanted to cross the room and take her in his arms the way he had done thousands of times before. But the woman crying in his study was both the wife he adored and a stranger who had been lying to him since the day they met, and he no longer knew how to reconcile those two realities. "The intelligence service wants you arrested," he said quietly. "Director Hawthorne believes you're still an active threat to national security." Isabella wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the gesture somehow making her look younger and more vulnerable despite everything he now knew about her. "And what do you believe?" Alexander looked at the woman who had been the center of his world for 2 decades, trying to see past the layers of deception to whatever truth lay beneath. What he found there surprised him. Not the hardened revolutionary from the old photographs, not the perfect princess from the society pages, but someone caught between two identities and desperate to find a way to make peace with both. "I believe," he said slowly, "that we need to find a way to fix this that doesn't destroy everything we've built together." Isabella looked up at him with something that might have been hope. "And is that possible?" Alexander moved to his desk and pressed the intercom that connected him directly to his private secretary. "Margaret, please cancel my appointments for the rest of the day and arrange for a secure line to Director Hawthorne. I need to discuss some new developments in the Reeves situation." "Yes, Your Highness," came Margaret's crisp reply. Alexander released the intercom and looked back at his wife, the stranger, the woman who had somehow managed to be both his greatest love and his greatest deception. "We're going to figure this out," he said firmly. "But from now on, no more lies between us. If we're going to save this marriage and protect the crown, I need to know everything. Every mission, every contact, every secret you've been keeping. All of it." Isabella nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. "Where do you want me to start?" Alexander sat down behind his desk and gestured for her to take the chair across from him. "Start with the truth about who you really are. Not Sophia Reeves, not Isabella Hartwell, but the person you've become in the 20 years since I've known you. Because that's the woman I need to understand if we're going to find a way through this." As Isabella began to speak, her voice steady and clear despite the tears still clinging to her lashes, Alexander realized that this conversation was either going to save their marriage or destroy it completely. But, for the first time in his life, he was more interested in the truth than in protecting himself from its consequences. The morning mist had burned away outside his window, leaving the palace gardens bright and clear in the sunshine. Whatever shadows had been hiding in his life were about to be dragged into the light, and Alexander found himself strangely grateful for the illumination, no matter how painful it might prove to be. The secure conference room in the basement of Aldoria Palace felt more like a bunker than a meeting space, its reinforced walls and advanced soundproofing designed to keep the most sensitive state secrets contained within its stark white confines. Alexander sat at the head of the polished steel table, his reflection fractured into multiple distorted images across its surface, while Director Hawthorne occupied the seat to his right, with the rigid posture of a military man who had never quite learned to relax. Edward Hawthorne was 53 years old and had spent the last 30 of them in service to the crown, first as a field operative and later as the head of Aldoria's intelligence apparatus. His gray hair was clipped short with mathematical precision, his steel-blue eyes missed nothing, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency had made him both invaluable and slightly terrifying to 3 successive monarchs. He was not, Alexander reflected, the sort of man who would appreciate what he was about to propose. "Director," Alexander began carefully, "I want to discuss alternative approaches to the Reeves situation." Hawthorne's expression didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested he had been expecting this conversation. "Your Highness, with respect, there are protocols in place for exactly this type of security breach. The princess needs to be taken into custody immediately and subjected to a full interrogation. Every contact, every piece of information she may have passed along, every aspect of her network needs to be identified and neutralized. And after that, prison," Hawthorne said bluntly, "likely for the rest of her natural life." The charges against her include espionage, treason, identity fraud, and conspiracy against the crown. Even if we could somehow avoid a public trial, she would never again be free. Alexander had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment, weighing duty against love, crown against heart, and he still wasn't entirely sure he was making the right choice. But he was certain that watching Isabella disappear into the maw of the justice system would destroy something essential in him that he wasn't prepared to sacrifice. "What if I told you there was another way?" he asked quietly. Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I would say that your Highness is thinking with his heart rather than his head, and that such thinking has historically led to the downfall of more kingdoms than foreign invasion. And what if I told you that the princess has offered to provide complete intelligence on her former network in exchange for alternative arrangements?" That got Hawthorne's attention. The director leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. What sort of alternative arrangements? Alexander had rehearsed this moment, but the words still felt strange in his mouth. Complete exile from Aldoria. Relocation to a secure facility where she can be monitored but not imprisoned. In exchange, she provides everything she knows about the organization that recruited her and has continued to operate within European royal circles. Absolutely not. Hawthorne's response was immediate and definitive. "Your Highness, this woman has spent 20 years in the heart of your government, with access to classified information that could compromise the security of this nation for decades to come. The intelligence she possesses about our defense capabilities, our diplomatic strategies, our economic policies, it's incalculable. We can't simply send her away with a stern warning and hope for the best. She would be under constant surveillance," Alexander pressed. "Full electronic monitoring, restricted communications, limited movement. Essentially house arrest, but in comfortable conditions that acknowledge her cooperation." Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently against the table surface. "May I speak freely, Your Highness?" "Always." "You're being manipulated," Hawthorne said with the kind of gentle firmness usually reserved for telling children that their pets had died. "This woman is a trained operative who has spent 2 decades perfecting the art of deception. The tears, the confessions, the claims that she fell in love with you and was trying to protect you. It's all performance designed to exploit your emotional attachment to her." Alexander had been expecting this response, but hearing it stated so bluntly still felt like a physical blow. "You're saying none of it was real." "I'm saying that even if some of it was real, it doesn't matter," Hawthorne replied. "She is a threat to national security that needs to be contained, regardless of what either of you may feel about the situation." "And what about the intelligence she's offering?" Hawthorne's expression suggested he found this the most interesting part of the proposal. "What specifically has she told you about her network?" Alexander consulted the notes he had taken during his conversations with Isabella over the past 3 days. The organization calls itself the Democratic Reform Coalition. It's not a government operation, but rather a loose network of individuals who believe that European monarchies wield too much unelected power in the modern world. They've placed operatives in royal households across the continent, gathering intelligence not for foreign governments, but to expose what they consider to be anti-democratic abuses of power. How many operatives? At least 12 active agents across 6 kingdoms, possibly more. Isabella was their most successful placement because of her marriage to me, but there are others in positions of trust within various royal households. Hawthorne made a note on the tablet in front of him. Names. She's provided 17 names of individuals she knows to be part of the network, including 3 who are currently employed by allied royal families, and for who hold positions in various European governments. That definitely had Hawthorne's attention now, and she's willing to provide this information in exchange for exile rather than imprisonment. She says that her loyalty shifted years ago from the organization to the crown, and that she's been quietly sabotaging their operations for more than a decade. She claims that several planned operations against various royal families were abandoned because she provided false information or otherwise interfered with their execution. Claims. Hawthorne emphasized the word heavily. "Your Highness, even if everything she's telling you is true, it doesn't change the fundamental security threat she represents. The information in her head about our operations, our vulnerabilities, our classified programs, it's a walking intelligence disaster waiting to happen." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying the older man's face. "Edward, may I ask you something personal?" Hawthorne looked momentarily uncomfortable at the shift in tone, but nodded. "Are you married?" "I was," Hawthorne replied carefully. "My wife died 7 years ago. Cancer." Did you love her? Very much. Alexander nodded slowly. Then, perhaps you can understand why the prospect of sending my wife to prison for the rest of her life feels like a form of death to me. I can understand it, Hawthorne said gently, but I can't let personal feelings override my responsibility to protect this kingdom. Your Highness, I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've seen what happens when emotional compromise clouds operational judgment. Good people die. What if there was a way to ensure that the intelligence threat was contained while still allowing for a solution that doesn't destroy 2 lives in the process? Hawthorne was quiet for several moments, his expression thoughtful. What exactly are you proposing? Alexander extracted a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. Complete relocation to a facility that we control. Not a prison, but not freedom either. She would live under constant surveillance in comfortable but isolated conditions, with communication limited to approved channels and movement restricted to a defined area. In exchange, she provides full debriefing on everything she knows about her network and submits to regular polygraph examinations to ensure ongoing compliance. Hawthorne opened the folder and studied the documents inside. Alexander had spent considerable time developing the proposal, consulting with legal experts and security specialists to create something that might actually be workable. The Blackwood Estate, Hawthorne read from the file. I'm familiar with it. Former safe house, approximately 200 acres in the Scottish Highlands, completely isolated and easily monitored. The estate has been renovated to serve as a comfortable residence while maintaining maximum security. Electronic monitoring throughout, restricted communications, but with amenities that would make long-term residence tolerable. She would have access to books, music, gardens, even supervised visits from approved individuals. Supervised visits. Hawthorne looked up from the file. Including visits from you, I assume. Alexander met his gaze steadily. Yes. Your Highness, you understand that this arrangement would essentially mean the end of your marriage as a public institution? The princess would have to be declared dead or missing. Your union would be dissolved, and you would need to eventually remarry to secure the succession. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, even though he had been expecting them. I understand. And you're prepared for that sacrifice? Alexander was quiet for a long time, thinking about the life he had built with Isabella and the future they had planned together. 20 years of shared dreams, of quiet moments and public triumphs, of building something beautiful together in the constrained space that royal life allowed. All of it would have to be sacrificed to protect the woman who had made it possible. I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary to protect both my wife and my kingdom, he said finally. Hawthorne studied him for several more moments before closing the folder. I'll need guarantees. Full disclosure of everything she knows, ongoing cooperation with our intelligence operations, and absolute compliance with the terms of her confinement. Any violation, any sign that she's attempting to contact her former network or compromise our security in any way, and the deal is off. You'll consider it? I'll present the proposal to the Privy Council, Hawthorne said carefully. But, Your Highness, you should understand that this is likely to be a very difficult sell. There are members of the council who will see any arrangement short of a firing squad as unacceptable leniency. Alexander nodded. I'll handle the council. And the public story? That was the part of the plan that Alexander had been dreading most. The official story will be that the princess has suffered a complete nervous breakdown following the stress of recent royal duties. She'll be admitted to a private psychiatric facility in Scotland for intensive treatment, with an indefinite timeline for recovery. That might work in the short term, Hawthorne mused, but eventually people will expect either recovery or resolution. Eventually, Alexander said quietly, the princess will be declared to have died from complications related to her mental health crisis. There will be a funeral, a period of mourning, and then life will continue. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but Alexander had spent days working through the logistics and had concluded that it was the only way to make the arrangement work. Isabella would have to disappear from the world completely, sacrificing not just her freedom but her very identity to protect the secret of what she had been. You're asking her to give up everything, Hawthorne observed. I'm asking her to make the same choice I'm making, Alexander replied. To sacrifice everything we want for everything we believe in. Hawthorne gathered up the documents and tucked them back into the folder. I'll need to speak with her directly before I can make any recommendations to the council. Full debriefing, polygraph examination, psychological evaluation to determine her mental state and reliability. That can be arranged. And, Your Highness? I want to be very clear about something. If this arrangement is approved and subsequently fails, if the princess violates the terms of her confinement or attempts to reconnect with her former network, there will be no second chances. The next conversation we have about this matter will be about execution rather than exile. Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach at the director's words, but he nodded his understanding. I'll make sure she understands the terms. Hawthorne stood to leave, then paused at the door. Your Highness, may I offer some personal advice? Of course. Be very careful that you're not letting love blind you to the possibility that this is all still part of her mission. The greatest operatives are the ones who can make their targets believe that the operation has ended when it's actually just entering its most crucial phase. With that sobering thought, Hawthorne left Alexander alone in the secure conference room, staring at his fractured reflection in the polished steel table and wondering whether he was making the decision of a wise king or a foolish husband. 3 hours later, Alexander found Isabella in the palace's private garden, tending to the rose bushes they had planted together on their 5th wedding anniversary. She looked up as he approached, her face a careful mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil he knew must be churning inside her. How did it go? She asked quietly. Alexander sat down on the stone bench beside the rose bed, suddenly feeling every one of his 38 years. Hawthorne will present the proposal to the Privy Council tomorrow. If they approve it, you'll be transferred to a facility in Scotland where you'll spend the rest of your life under house arrest. Isabella continued working with the roses, her movements careful and precise. And the price for this mercy? Everything you know about your network. Every name, every operation, every piece of intelligence you've gathered over the past 20 years. Complete cooperation with our security services, and absolute compliance with the terms of your confinement. And if I refuse? Alexander looked at the woman he loved, memorizing the curve of her neck, the way the afternoon light caught in her hair, the graceful precision of her movements. Soon, these stolen moments would be all he had left of their life together. Then, you'll spend the rest of your life in a prison cell, and I'll spend the rest of mine knowing that I failed to save you. Isabella set down her gardening shears and turned to face him fully. And what happens to us? There is no us anymore, Alexander said gently. Isabella Hartwell will disappear from the world completely. Our marriage will be dissolved. Our life together will become nothing but a memory that I'll have to carry in secret. But you'll visit me? As often as security allows. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. It's not the ending I imagined for us. No, Alexander agreed. But it's the only ending where we both survive. She reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become second nature over 20 years of marriage. I need you to know something, Alexander. Whatever else you may doubt about me, whatever lies I've told or secrets I've kept, I need you to believe that loving you was the most real thing I've ever done in my life. Alexander squeezed her hand gently. I know. Do you? Because sometimes I look at you and I see doubt in your eyes, and I understand why it's there, but it breaks my heart anyway. Alexander turned to face her fully, taking her other hand so that they were connected in the way they had been on their wedding day when they made promises to each other that had seemed unbreakable at the time. I believe that you love me, he said firmly. I believe that somewhere in the middle of your mission, you became someone different than who you started as. But I also believe that Director Hawthorne is right about the danger you represent, and that the only way to protect both you and the kingdom is to find a solution that acknowledges both realities. So we sacrifice our happiness for duty. We sacrifice our happiness for each other, Alexander corrected. Because this is the only way I can live with myself, knowing that you're safe, and that I haven't betrayed my oath to the crown. Isabella brought his hands to her lips and kissed them gently. Then, I'll take your deal, Your Highness. I'll tell them everything I know and disappear into whatever exile you've arranged for me. But I want something in return. What? I want you to promise me that you'll move on with your life, that you'll remarry and have children and be happy, that you won't spend the rest of your life mourning something that was built on deception from the very beginning. Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. Isabella, promise me, she insisted. Because if you don't, then all of this sacrifice will have been for nothing. Alexander looked into the green eyes that had captivated him for 20 years, seeing in them both the woman he had fallen in love with and the stranger she had revealed herself to be. I promised to try. It wasn't the promise she had asked for, but it was the only one he could honestly make. As they sat together in the garden where they had shared so many peaceful moments, both of them understood that they were living in the final hours of their life together. Tomorrow, the council would meet to decide Isabella's fate. Tomorrow, the machinery of government would begin the process of erasing Isabella Hartwell from existence. Tomorrow, they would both begin the long journey toward a future that neither of them had ever imagined. But tonight, they were still husband and wife, sitting in their garden as the sun set over the palace grounds, holding hands and trying to memorize the feeling of being together before it was taken away from them forever. The Privy Council chamber at Aldoria Palace had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the declaration of wars, and the negotiation of peace treaties that had shaped the course of European history. Its oak-paneled walls bore the portraits of 15 generations of monarchs, their painted eyes seeming to observe the proceedings with the weight of centuries of royal precedent. Today, those same walls would bear witness to a decision that would either save or damn the future of the crown itself. King Edmund Mordaunt sat at the head of the ancient mahogany table, his 71-year-old frame still commanding despite the toll that 4 decades of rule had taken on his health. His blue eyes, so similar to his son's, held the sharp intelligence that had guided Aldoria through numerous crises. But today they were clouded with a weariness that spoke to the magnitude of the situation they faced. Around the table sat the 7 other members of the Privy Council. Director Hawthorne representing intelligence and security, Lord Chancellor Blackwood handling legal affairs, Defense Minister Cromwell, Foreign Secretary Ashworth, Archbishop Pemberton speaking for the Church, Lord Chief Justice Wellington, and Dame Catherine Fairfax, who had served as the royal family's chief advisor for more than 20 years. Prince Alexander occupied the chair to his father's right, his face a carefully composed mask that revealed nothing of the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. He had spent the early morning hours in final preparations for this moment, reviewing intelligence reports and legal precedents, crafting arguments and contingencies. But no amount of preparation could have readied him for the reality of sitting in judgment of his wife's fate while maintaining the appearance of royal detachment. Director Hawthorne, King Edmund began, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades on the throne. Please present your findings regarding the security breach within the royal household. Hawthorne stood and activated the room's presentation system, filling the large screen at the far end of the chamber with a chronological timeline spanning 25 years. Your Majesty, members of the Council, what we are dealing with is the most successful long-term intelligence operation ever conducted against the Aldorian crown. The director walked through the evidence methodically, the falsified identity documents, the genetic confirmation, the network of contacts, the scope of information that Isabella had been positioned to access. Each revelation landed like a hammer blow, building a case that painted the woman Alexander loved as a threat of unprecedented magnitude. The subject now known as Princess Isabella has had access to classified defense briefings, diplomatic negotiations, intelligence assessments, and state security protocols for nearly 2 decades, Hawthorne continued. The potential damage to national security is incalculable. Lord Chancellor Blackwood leaned forward, his expression grim. Director, in your professional assessment, what is the appropriate response to a breach of this magnitude? Under normal circumstances, Hawthorne replied carefully, the subject would be arrested immediately, subjected to intensive interrogation, and ultimately charged with high treason. The penalty for which, as we all know, has historically been death. Archbishop Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Surely we're not contemplating such an extreme measure in this day and age. The law regarding treason has not changed, Your Grace, Lord Chief Justice Wellington observed dryly. Though I grant that modern sensibilities might call for life imprisonment rather than execution. Alexander had remained silent through the presentation, but now he found his voice. Director Hawthorne, would you please share with the Council the alternative proposal we discussed? Hawthorne nodded and changed the display to show architectural plans and security specifications. His Royal Highness has proposed an arrangement whereby the subject would be relocated to a secure facility under permanent house arrest in exchange for complete cooperation with our intelligence services. House arrest. Defense Minister Cromwell's voice carried sharp disapproval. For a crime of this magnitude, it's unconscionable. The arrangement would not be comfortable imprisonment, Alexander interjected. The subject would be under constant surveillance, with severely restricted communications and movement. To the outside world, she would simply cease to exist. Dame Catherine Fairfax spoke for the first time since the meeting began. And What of the succession, Your Highness? Your marriage would need to be dissolved, and the kingdom requires heirs to secure the future of the crown. The question that Alexander had been dreading hung in the air like a sword over his head. I understand the implications for the succession, Dame Catherine. I am prepared to fulfill my duties to the kingdom in whatever way the council deems appropriate. King Edmund studied his son with an expression that seemed to see straight through his careful composure. Alexander, I need to understand your reasoning for proposing this alternative. Is it purely emotional, or do you see strategic value in keeping this woman alive and cooperative? Alexander had rehearsed his answer, but speaking the words aloud still felt like swallowing glass. Father, the intelligence value of what she can provide is enormous. Not only details about her own network, but insights into how foreign intelligence services operate, how they recruit and place assets, how they maintain cover for extended periods. That knowledge could help us identify and neutralize similar threats in the future. And you believe this intelligence value outweighs the security risk she represents? Foreign Secretary Ashworth asked. I believe it's worth considering, yes. Director Hawthorne cleared his throat. If I may, Your Majesty, there is another factor to consider. The subject has claimed that she has been actively sabotaging her network's operations for more than a decade, providing false information and preventing planned actions against various royal families. If true, this suggests that her loyalty may have genuinely shifted. If true, Lord Chancellor Blackwood emphasized. But how can we possibly verify such claims? Polygraph examination, psychological evaluation, cross-reference verification of the intelligence she provides, Hawthorne replied. It wouldn't be foolproof, but it would give us a reasonable assessment of her truthfulness. Archbishop Pemberton leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. There is also the moral dimension to consider. This woman has been living a lie for 20 years, but she has also been a devoted wife, a conscientious royal, and a positive influence on charitable work throughout the kingdom. The person she became, regardless of who she started as, has served the crown faithfully. She's been a spy. Defense Minister Cromwell exploded. A foreign agent who wormed her way into the heart of our government. You're talking about her as if she were some misguided romantic rather than a trained operative who has had access to state secrets for 2 decades. And yet, Dame Catherine observed quietly, there is no evidence that she has ever acted against the interests of the crown. Quite the opposite, in fact. Her advice on policy matters has consistently been sound. Her charitable work has enhanced the monarchy's reputation, and her marriage to Prince Alexander has been one of the most stabilizing factors in the royal family for a generation. King Edmund had been listening to the debate with the patient attention of a man accustomed to weighing complex decisions. But now he raised his hand for silence. Alexander, I want you to answer one question with complete honesty. Are you proposing this arrangement because you believe it's in the best interests of the kingdom, or because you cannot bear the thought of losing your wife? The question cut straight to the heart of Alexander's internal conflict, the place where duty and love had been warring for days. He met his father's eyes steadily, knowing that this moment would define not just Isabella's fate, but his own. Both, he said quietly. I believe the intelligence she can provide is genuinely valuable, and I believe that her loyalty to the crown has become authentic over the years. But you're right that my personal feelings are influencing my judgment. I love her, father. Despite everything she's done, despite every lie she's told, I love the woman she became during our marriage. And I'm not sure I can be the king this kingdom needs if I allow that woman to be destroyed. The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of centuries of royal tradition. Kings throughout history had been forced to choose between personal desire and public duty, and the chronicles were full of cautionary tales about rulers who chose poorly. Dame Catherine broke the silence with characteristic directness. Your Majesty, perhaps the question we should be asking is not whether Princess Isabella deserves mercy, but whether we can afford to grant it. The monarchy's survival has always depended on maintaining the trust of the people. If this situation ever becomes public knowledge, how do we explain our decision? The situation will never become public knowledge, Director Hawthorne said firmly. The official story has already been prepared. The princess is suffering from a severe nervous breakdown and has been admitted to a private medical facility for treatment. Eventually, she will be reported to have died from complications related to her condition. And you're confident that this cover story will hold? Lord Chief Justice Wellington asked. The facility in Scotland is completely secure and isolated. Electronic surveillance will ensure that no unauthorized communication occurs. The risk of exposure is minimal. Foreign Secretary Ashworth looked troubled. But what about the diplomatic implications? If Princess Isabella's former network realizes what has happened, if they attempt to extract her or expose her location, we could be looking at an international incident. Which is precisely why complete debriefing is essential, Hawthorne replied. If she provides us with the full scope of her network, we can neutralize the threat before it materializes. King Edmund had been making notes throughout the discussion, and now he set down his pen and looked around the table at his advisors. I want to hear from each of you individually. Lord Chancellor, what is your recommendation? Blackwood straightened in his chair. From a legal standpoint, the crimes are clear and the penalties are well established. However, the proposed arrangement does offer significant intelligence value while still ensuring that justice is served. I can support the alternative proposal with appropriate legal safeguards. Defense Minister? Cromwell's expression remained stern. I believe we're setting a dangerous precedent by showing leniency to a foreign operative. However, if the intelligence she provides helps us identify and neutralize similar threats, there may be strategic value to the arrangement. Reluctant approval. Foreign Secretary? The diplomatic risks are manageable if we can neutralize her network quickly and completely. I support the proposal contingent on full intelligence cooperation. Archbishop? Pemberton smiled slightly. Mercy has always been a virtue of good governance, Your Majesty. If we can achieve justice while preserving life and extracting value from a regrettable situation, we honor both the law and our Christian principles. Lord Chief Justice? Wellington was quiet for a moment. The law demands punishment proportionate to the crime. Permanent exile under strict surveillance can be considered a form of life imprisonment. Legally acceptable. Dame Catherine. The veteran advisor looked directly at Prince Alexander as she spoke. Your Majesty, I believe that the arrangement proposed by His Royal Highness represents the best possible outcome given the circumstances. It protects the crown, secures valuable intelligence, and demonstrates the kind of wisdom and mercy that will serve Prince Alexander well when he eventually assumes the throne. All eyes turned to King Edmund, who had been listening to each response with the careful attention that had characterized his long reign. Director Hawthorne, final recommendation? Hawthorne stood again, his military bearing evident. Your Majesty, while every instinct tells me that a traditional response would be more appropriate, I believe the proposed arrangement offers unique strategic advantages. I recommend approval, with strict conditions and constant monitoring. King Edmund was quiet for several long minutes. His fingers steepled before him as he weighed the decision that would affect not just his family, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute decision. The Council will approve the alternative arrangement proposed by Prince Alexander, subject to the following conditions. First, Princess Isabella will undergo complete debriefing and provide full intelligence on her network. Second, she will submit to regular polygraph examinations and psychological evaluations. Third, any violation of the terms of her confinement will result in immediate transfer to maximum security prison. Fourth, the official cover story will be maintained indefinitely, with no exceptions. Alexander felt something in his chest ease for the first time in days. Thank you, Father. Don't thank me yet, King Edmund said gravely. Because there is one more condition that I haven't mentioned. Alexander's relief turned to apprehension. What condition? You will visit her exactly once, to ensure that she is settled and secure in her new circumstances. After that, you will have no further contact with her for a period of 5 years. During that time, you will fulfill your duties as heir to the throne, including beginning the process of finding a suitable bride to secure the succession. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He had expected restrictions, but 5 years of complete separation felt like a death sentence. Father, surely, this is not negotiable, King Edmund said firmly. If you want to save her life, these are the terms. The kingdom needs an heir who is not compromised by emotional attachment to a woman who can never again be part of his public life. 5 years will give you time to adjust to your new circumstances and fulfill your obligations to the crown. Alexander looked around the table at the faces of the council members, seeing in their expressions the same mixture of sympathy and finality. This was the price of mercy, not just Isabella's exile, but his own emotional isolation. I accept the terms, he said quietly. King Edmund nodded. Then, it is decided. Director Hawthorne, you will coordinate the transfer and begin the debriefing process immediately. The rest of us will begin implementing the cover story. This meeting is adjourned. As the council members filed out of the chamber, Alexander remained seated, staring at the portraits of his ancestors, and wondering how many of them had faced similar impossible choices between duty and love. The decision had been made. Isabella's life had been saved, but the cost was higher than he had ever imagined. Tomorrow, he would have to tell his wife that she was about to disappear from the world forever, and that he would not be allowed to follow her into exile. Tomorrow, he would have to begin the process of learning to live without the woman who had been the center of his world for 20 years. Tonight, he would hold her one last time and try to memorize the feeling of being complete before duty tore them apart forever. The Blackwood estate sat like a forgotten jewel in the Scottish Highlands, its gray stone walls rising from the mist-shrouded moors with the timeless dignity of architecture that had weathered centuries of storms. Once the ancestral home of a powerful clan, then a Victorian hunting lodge, and most recently a government-safe house, it had been transformed into something unprecedented, a gilded cage designed to contain a secret that could topple kingdoms. Princess Isabella stood at the tall windows of what would become her sitting room, watching the morning light gradually burn away the fog that cloaked the surrounding hills. 3 days had passed since the Privy Council's decision, 3 days of intensive debriefing sessions with Director Hawthorne's team, 3 days of medical examinations and psychological evaluations, 3 days of saying goodbye to a life she would never see again. The estate itself was beautiful in its isolation, she had to admit. Rolling grounds stretched to the horizon, interrupted only by ancient stone walls and the occasional cluster of Highland cattle. The house had been renovated with careful attention to both security and comfort. Elegant furnishings, a well-stocked library, modern amenities hidden behind period details, and everywhere, the subtle but unmistakable presence of electronic surveillance. It's quite lovely, isn't it? Isabella turned to find Dr. Margaret Sinclair, the psychiatrist who would be monitoring her mental health during her confinement. Dr. Sinclair was a woman of perhaps 55, with kind eyes and graying auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her manner was professional but warm, suggesting that she understood the delicate nature of her assignment. It is, Isabella agreed. I suppose as prisons go, I could have done much worse. Dr. Sinclair moved to stand beside her at the window. I prefer to think of it as a sanctuary rather than a prison, a place where you can find peace and perhaps discover who you really are when all the roles and deceptions are stripped away. Isabella smiled ruefully. I'm not sure that person exists anymore, Doctor. After 20 years of being Isabella Hartwell, I'm not certain where the performance ends and the reality begins. That's something we can explore together, if you're willing. Understanding your authentic self will be crucial to your psychological well-being during your time here. Through the window, Isabella could see a black sedan making its way up the winding drive toward the house. Her heart clenched as she recognized it as one of the royal family's security vehicles. Alexander had come, as promised, for what would be their final meeting for 5 long years. I should prepare myself, Isabella said quietly. That will be Prince Alexander arriving. Dr. Sinclair nodded with professional understanding. I'll give you some privacy, but remember that our conversation this afternoon will help me assess how you're processing these transitions. Don't hesitate to call if you need support before then. After the psychiatrist left, Isabella remained at the window, watching as the sedan pulled to a stop in front of the main entrance. Alexander emerged from the passenger seat, his tall frame immediately recognizable even at a distance. He moved with the controlled grace she had always admired, but something in his posture suggested the weight he was carrying. She moved away from the window and settled herself in one of the chairs by the fireplace, arranging her navy dress carefully and trying to compose her features into something resembling serenity. Whatever this conversation brought, she owed it to Alexander to handle it with dignity. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced his arrival before the soft knock on her door. Come in, she called, proud that her voice remained steady. Alexander entered alone, closing the door behind him with a decisive click. He wore a charcoal gray suit that emphasized the aristocratic lines of his features, but his blue eyes held a weariness that spoke to sleepless nights and impossible decisions. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their transformed circumstances filling the space between them. You look well, Alexander said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Are they treating you properly? Very well, Isabella replied. The accommodations are quite comfortable, and the staff has been nothing but professional and courteous. I have books, music, gardens to walk in when the weather permits. It's hardly the dungeon I might have expected. Alexander moved to the chair across from her, but remained standing. The debriefing sessions have been going well. Director Hawthorne seems pleased with my cooperation. I've provided everything I know about the network, every name, every operation, every piece of intelligence I was ever asked to gather or transmit. The polygraph examinations have confirmed that I'm being truthful. And you're satisfied that you've given them everything? Isabella met his eyes directly. Alexander, I stopped being loyal to the Democratic Reform Coalition more than a decade ago. Whatever threat they might have posed to you or your family, I neutralized it years ago. The debriefing has simply made that protection official. Alexander finally sat down, his movements careful and controlled. Hawthorne tells me that the intelligence you've provided has already led to the identification of 3 other operatives in European royal households. The network is being systematically dismantled. Good. Perhaps some good can come from all of this destruction. They fell into silence again, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Isabella studied Alexander's face, trying to memorize every detail before their enforced separation began. The slight lines around his eyes that appeared when he was thinking deeply, the way his jaw tightened when he was struggling with emotion, the particular shade of blue his eyes became when he was trying not to reveal what he was feeling. How long can you stay? She asked quietly. A few hours. I need to be back in London tonight for a state dinner with the Prime Minister. Of course. The kingdom continues, regardless of our personal circumstances. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees. Isabella, I need to tell you about the council's final decision regarding our future contact. Something in his tone made her stomach clench with apprehension. What about it? After today, I won't be able to visit you for 5 years. No communication, no contact of any kind. The council feels that I need time to adjust to my new circumstances and fulfill my obligations to the crown without emotional complications. The words hit Isabella like a physical blow, even though some part of her had been expecting them. 5 years. 5 years of complete isolation from the man who had been the center of her world for 2 decades. 5 years, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I fought it, Isabella. I argued that the separation was unnecessarily cruel, that periodic supervised visits would pose no security risk. But my father was adamant. He believes that maintaining any connection between us would compromise my ability to fulfill my duties as heir to the throne. Isabella forced herself to remain composed, though every instinct screamed at her to rage against the unfairness of it all. And after 5 years? After 5 years, if my circumstances permit it, I may be allowed occasional supervised visits. But by then, Alexander's voice trailed off. By then, you'll be married to someone else and starting the family that the kingdom requires, Isabella finished for him. I understand, Alexander. I've always understood that our time together was borrowed. That doesn't make this any easier. Isabella rose from her chair and moved to the window again, needing the distance to maintain her composure. In some ways, it's a kindness, she said finally. Clean breaks heal more quickly than wounds that are constantly reopened. Is that how you see our marriage? As a wound that needs to heal? Isabella turned back to face him, seeing the pain in his eyes that he was trying so hard to conceal. I see our marriage as the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me, built on a foundation of lies that made it ultimately unsustainable. Yes, it's a wound, Alexander. For both of us. But it's also the most precious memory I'll carry with me through whatever comes next. Alexander stood and crossed the room to her, stopping just close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. Not falling in love with you, not marrying you, not fighting to save your life when I discovered the truth. Even knowing everything I know now, I would make the same choices. Even knowing that it means giving up our future together. Even then, Isabella reached up and touched his face gently, her fingertips tracing the familiar contours of his cheekbone. Then, we've been very lucky, haven't we? 20 years of happiness built on impossible circumstances. Some people never get even 1 year of what we had. Alexander covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm against his cheek. I love you, Isabella. Whatever name you choose to use in the years ahead, whatever person you decide to become in this new life, I will always love the woman you became during our marriage. And I love you, Alexander Mordaunt. I love your kindness, your integrity, your unwavering commitment to doing what's right even when it costs you everything you want. I love the man you are and the king you're going to be. They stood there for a long moment, memorizing each other's faces, holding on to the connection that had sustained them through 2 decades of public and private challenges. Then, Alexander stepped back, his royal training asserting itself over his personal desires. I should go, he said quietly. The longer I stay, the harder it becomes to leave. Isabella nodded, though every fiber of her being wanted to beg him to stay just a little longer. Will you do something for me? Anything. When you do marry again, when you start the family that will secure the succession, I want you to be happy. Don't choose duty over love again, Alexander. Find someone who makes you laugh, someone who challenges you, someone who sees the man behind the crown. Promise me you'll try to build something real and beautiful again. Alexander's throat worked as he struggled with emotion. And what about you? What will you build in this new life? Isabella smiled, though tears were beginning to gather in her eyes. I'll build peace, I think. I'll read books and tend gardens and, perhaps finally, figure out who I really am when I'm not performing for anyone. It won't be the life I dreamed of, but it will be honest in a way that my life has never been before. That sounds like it could be enough. I hope so. Alexander moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Isabella, if circumstances ever change, if the political situation shifts or new information comes to light that might alter your status, I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to bring you home. I know, but don't waste your life waiting for circumstances that may never change. Live, Alexander. Be the king your kingdom needs, and the man you want to be. Goodbye, Isabella. Goodbye, my love. After he left, Isabella remained standing by the window, watching the black sedan disappear down the winding drive and into the mist. She stood there until the sun set behind the Highland Hills, until the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, until the weight of her new reality finally settled into her bones. Dr. Sinclair found her there hours later, still standing vigil at the window. How are you feeling? The psychiatrist asked gently. Isabella turned away from the window and faced the woman who would be her primary human contact for the foreseeable future. Free, she said, surprised to discover that it was true. For the first time in 25 years, I feel completely free. No more lies, no more deception, no more pretending to be someone I'm not. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. That's a healthy response, Dr. Sinclair observed. Many people in your situation struggle with depression and despair. The fact that you're able to find meaning in your new circumstances suggests a strong psychological foundation. Isabella moved to the chair by the fireplace and settled herself with the grace that had been trained into her during years of royal protocol. Doctor, may I ask you something? Of course. Do you think it's possible to discover who you really are at 35, after spending more than half your life being various other people? Dr. Sinclair smiled warmly. I think it's not only possible, but inevitable. The question isn't whether you'll discover your authentic self, but whether you'll have the courage to embrace what you find. As the fire crackled in the grate, and the Highland winds whispered around the old stone walls, Isabella reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything she thought she wanted, her identity, her marriage, her freedom, but perhaps she had gained something more valuable, the opportunity to finally be real. The woman who had started as Sophia Reeves and become Isabella Hartwell would now have the chance to discover who she actually was beneath all the constructed identities. It wasn't the ending she had imagined for her story, but perhaps, with time and courage, it could become a beginning. 5 years had passed since Princess Isabella Hartwell officially died from complications related to a nervous breakdown, and the world had moved on as the world always does, absorbing tragedy and scandal with the efficient indifference of history. The newspapers had mourned the loss of a beloved royal for an appropriate period. The public had sent flowers and condolences, and gradually the memory of the beautiful princess who had graced the covers of magazines for 2 decades began to fade into the warm nostalgia reserved for figures who die young and leave behind only their best moments. Crown Prince Alexander, now 43 and bearing the additional weight that 5 years of solo royal duties had pressed into his shoulders, stood in his private office at Aldoria Palace reading the morning intelligence briefings that had become part of his daily routine. The reports contained the usual mixture of domestic political developments, international trade negotiations, and security assessments, but buried in the middle was a single paragraph that made his hands shake slightly as he read it. Subject remains in good physical and mental health at current location. Recent psychological evaluations indicate significant personal growth and adaptation to circumstances. No security incidents or communication attempts. Dr. Sinclair recommends continued monitoring, but notes that subject has fully integrated into current living situation and poses no ongoing risk to operational security. It was the same report Alexander had been receiving quarterly for 5 years. But today it felt different, because today marked exactly 5 years since his last conversation with the woman he still thought of as his wife, despite the legal dissolution of their marriage 3 years earlier. Today was the day when the Privy Council's arbitrary separation period would officially end, when he would theoretically be free to visit the woman who had been living in exile in the Scottish Highlands, while he rebuilt his life according to the kingdom's demands. But 5 years was a long time, long enough for wounds to heal and new attachments to form. Long enough for Prince Alexander to have done exactly what his father and the council had hoped. He had found someone new. Lady Catherine Pemberton was 28 years old, the daughter of a respected duke, and possessed all the qualities that royal advisors looked for in a future queen. She was intelligent, well-educated, charming in public, discreet in private, and genuinely committed to the charitable work that formed such an important part of modern royal duties. She was also beautiful, kind, and over the course of 2 years of careful courtship, she had managed to work her way past the walls that Alexander had built around his heart following his loss. Their engagement had been announced 6 months earlier to widespread public approval, and their wedding was scheduled for the following spring. Catherine knew nothing of Isabella's true fate, believing like the rest of the world that Alexander was a widower who had lost his beloved wife to mental illness. She had been patient with his emotional distance, understanding that grief could make intimacy difficult, never suspecting that his reluctance to fully commit his heart was due not to loss, but to the knowledge that his first love was still alive and waiting in exile. A soft knock on his office door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," Alexander called, quickly folding the intelligence report and placing it in his desk drawer. Lady Catherine entered with her characteristic grace, wearing a pale blue dress that complemented her blonde hair and brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. She carried herself with the confident poise of someone born to aristocracy, but without the entitled arrogance that sometimes accompanied such breeding. "Good morning, darling," she said, crossing to give him a brief kiss on the cheek. "I wanted to confirm the schedule for the charity luncheon this afternoon. The organizers have asked if you might be willing to say a few words about the new children's hospital wing." Alexander forced himself to focus on the present moment, on the woman who was about to become his wife, and the life they were building together. "Of course. Have my secretary coordinate with the event planners about timing and logistics." Catherine settled into the chair across from his desk, her expression growing more serious. "Alexander, is everything all right? You've seemed distracted lately, and I can't help but worry that you're having second thoughts about our engagement." The direct question caught him off guard, though he supposed he shouldn't have been surprised. Catherine was remarkably perceptive, and he had been struggling to maintain his usual composure as the 5-year anniversary approached. "Not about our engagement," he said carefully, which was technically true. "I suppose I've just been feeling the weight of responsibility lately. Preparing for marriage means preparing to truly step into my role as future king, and that's a daunting prospect." Catherine's expression softened with understanding. "I imagine it must be overwhelming at times. But you know that you won't be facing those responsibilities alone, don't you? Whatever challenges we encounter, we'll handle them together." Alexander looked at this woman who was offering to share his burdens, who was willing to take on the constraints and sacrifices of royal life because she believed in him and in their partnership. She deserved better than a husband who was still emotionally tethered to a woman she would never meet, a secret she could never know. "Catherine," he began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the conversation he knew they needed to have. "Yes. Do you ever wonder about Isabella? About what my first marriage was like, or whether you're in competition with a memory?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "I'd be lying if I said I never thought about her. You loved her very much, and that love shaped who you are today. I don't see her as competition because she's not here, and I am. But I do sometimes wonder if there's room in your heart for the kind of love we're building together." The honesty in her voice made Alexander's chest tighten with something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. "What kind of love do you think we're building?" "A partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection," Catherine replied. "Not the desperate passion of youth, but something steadier and more sustainable. The kind of love that can weather the pressures of public life and the challenges of raising children in the spotlight." "And that's enough for you?" Catherine smiled gently. "Alexander, I'm not a romantic girl who believes in fairy tale love stories. I'm a practical woman who understands that royal marriages are different from ordinary ones. What we have is real and valuable, even if it's not the all-consuming passion that poets write about. The question is whether it's enough for you. Alexander studied her face, seeing in her expression the wisdom and maturity that had drawn him to her in the first place. She was offering him a chance to build something genuine and lasting, something that could provide the stability that both he and the kingdom needed. But accepting that offer felt like a betrayal of everything he had shared with Isabella, even though he knew that holding on to the past was unfair to everyone involved. I want it to be enough, he said quietly. But you're not sure it is. I'm not sure I'm capable of the kind of emotional investment that marriage requires. 5 years of grief and duty have left me changed. Catherine reached across the desk and took his hand gently. Alexander, I've never expected you to love me the way you loved Isabella. I've seen the photographs, read the articles about how devoted you two were to each other. That was a once-in-a-lifetime connection, and I would be foolish to think I could replicate it. Then, what are we doing, Catherine? Why are we getting married if not for love? Because love comes in many forms, she replied. Because partnership and companionship and shared purpose can be just as valuable as passion. Because you need someone who can stand beside you when you become king. And because I believe we can build something good together, even if it's different from what you had before. Alexander felt something shift inside him as he listened to her words. Catherine wasn't asking him to forget Isabella or pretend that his first marriage hadn't mattered. She was simply asking for a chance to create something new, something that honored his past, while building toward a different kind of future. You're a remarkable woman, he said sincerely. And you're a good man who's been carrying grief and responsibility for too long. Perhaps it's time to set down some of that burden and allow yourself to be happy again. Before Alexander could respond, there was another knock on his office door. Enter, he called. Director Hawthorne stepped into the room, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes holding something that looked like urgency. Your Highness, Lady Catherine, I apologize for interrupting, but there's been a development that requires immediate attention. Catherine rose gracefully from her chair. I'll leave you to your business. Don't forget about the luncheon this afternoon. After she left, Hawthorne closed the door and activated the security protocols that would prevent their conversation from being monitored. Your Highness, I've received intelligence regarding the situation in Scotland. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. What kind of intelligence? Dr. Sinclair submitted her quarterly report yesterday, as usual. However, this morning she contacted my office directly with additional information that she felt couldn't wait for the normal reporting cycle. What information? Hawthorne consulted his tablet briefly. The subject has requested a meeting with you, sir. She claims to have information about a developing threat to the royal family that she can only share with you directly. Alexander felt the carefully constructed walls of his new life tremble. What kind of threat? She wouldn't elaborate to Dr. Sinclair, but she seemed genuinely distressed. She claims that someone from her former network has made contact with her, despite the security protocols that should have prevented any communication. The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow. If Isabella's former associates had found her, if they had somehow breached the security of the Blackwood estate, then everything they had sacrificed to protect might be in immediate jeopardy. How is that possible? Alexander demanded. The estate is completely isolated. All communications are monitored. There's no way for outside contact to occur without our knowledge. That's what concerns me, Your Highness. Either our security has been compromised, or the subject is lying for reasons we don't yet understand. Either possibility represents a significant threat. Alexander stood and began pacing behind his desk, his mind racing through the implications. If Isabella was telling the truth, then she might be in immediate danger, and the royal family might be facing a new threat from the network they thought they had neutralized. If she was lying, then she might be attempting to manipulate him for reasons he couldn't fathom. What's your recommendation, Director? Hawthorne's expression was grim. Standard protocol would be to increase security at the facility and interrogate the subject to determine the nature and credibility of the threat. However, given the specific request for a meeting with you, I believe your presence might be necessary to extract complete information. You're saying I should go to Scotland. I'm saying that the security of the realm may require it. Yes. Alexander stopped pacing and stared out the window at the palace gardens, the same gardens where he and Isabella had shared their last conversation 5 years earlier. He had built a new life, found a path forward, committed himself to a future that didn't include the woman who had been the center of his world for 2 decades. Now, with just a few words from Hawthorne, all of that progress seemed to be crumbling. When would this meeting need to take place? As soon as possible. If there is a genuine threat developing, time could be critical. Alexander thought about Catherine, about their engagement, about the life they were planning together. He thought about his father and the Privy Council, about the carefully maintained fiction that had allowed the kingdom to move past the scandal of Isabella's true identity. He thought about the promises he had made and the duties he had accepted. Then, he thought about Isabella, alone in the Scottish Highlands for 5 years, claiming to have information that could protect his family from danger. "Arrange the trip," he said quietly. "But I want maximum security protocols in place. If this is a trap, I don't want to walk into it blindly." "Understood, Your Highness. We can have you there and back within 24 hours without disrupting your public schedule." "And, Director?" "This conversation never happened. As far as anyone else is concerned, I'm making a routine inspection of government facilities in Scotland." "Of course, sir." After Hawthorne left, Alexander stood alone in his office, staring at the intelligence report that had started this chain of events. 24 hours from now, he would see Isabella again for the first time in 5 years. He would look into the green eyes that had haunted his dreams and try to determine whether she was warning him of genuine danger or attempting to manipulate him back into her orbit. The rational part of his mind insisted that this was simply another duty to be performed, another responsibility to be discharged in service to the crown. But his heart, the heart that he had thought was finally healing, began to race with something that felt dangerously like anticipation. By evening, Alexander was aboard a royal helicopter flying north toward the Scottish Highlands, watching the landscape change from the manicured beauty of southern England to the wild ruggedness of the moors. Director Hawthorne sat across from him, reviewing security protocols and threat assessments, but Alexander found himself unable to concentrate on the tactical details. 5 years. 5 years of carefully rebuilt routines, of new relationships, of learning to live without the woman who had been his anchor in the storm of royal life. 5 years of convincing himself that he had moved on, that he was ready to commit his future to someone else. Now, as the helicopter carried him toward a reunion he had never expected to have, Alexander realized that some wounds never fully heal. They simply learn to lie quiet until circumstances disturb them again. The Blackwood estate appeared below them as darkness was falling across the highlands, its windows glowing warmly against the stark landscape. Somewhere in those rooms, Isabella was waiting for him, and Alexander found himself wondering whether the woman he was about to meet would be the same person who had shared his life for 20 years, or whether 5 years of exile had transformed her into someone entirely new. As the helicopter settled onto the estate's small landing pad, Alexander took a deep breath and prepared to confront not just whatever threat Isabella claimed to have discovered, but the much more personal question of whether the love he thought he had laid to rest was really dead, or whether it had simply been waiting for the chance to destroy everything he had built in its absence. The answers to both questions would determine not just his immediate future, but the fate of the kingdom he was sworn to protect, and the woman he was engaged to marry. As he stepped out of the helicopter into the cold Highland air, Alexander realized that the next few hours would either finally close the chapter on his past with Isabella, or prove that some stories are too powerful to ever truly end.